We are now starting. I'm Peter Larson with the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. Welcome to everybody. If you're here for the end of year discussion with Michael Lynk, former special rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, you're at the right spot. I'm helped out by Grafton Ross. Grafton Ross is a geographer by training, a statistician, and the vice chair and head of research for the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. So, Michael, delighted to have you with us here tonight. And Grafton, thanks so much for joining in. Just before we start, I normally start off with a land recognition, which I think is important. And in recognition of the fact that we're on unceded territory, an OFIP board member has made a contribution to Inspire, which is an Indigenous organization aimed at helping Indigenous youth. But tonight, instead of the land recognition, I instead want to turn our attention to the atrocity that happened in Australia about 3 or 4 days ago with the murder of, I think it's now 15 Jews celebrating on Bondi Beach in Australia. A terrible event. The murdering of civilians should never be approved of or thought of positively in any way, shape, or form, irrespective of their who they are, religion or not. And the thoughts and prayers of OFIP goes out to Jewish Canadians who are now celebrating Hanukkah and to Jews around the world. Jews deserve to be safe in Canada, and we're very much in favor of efforts to make that so in Canada. So once again, I'm sure all of us feel the same way, and all of us at OFIP feel very much in sympathy with Jewish Canadians who are celebrating Hanukkah this week. The way we're going to proceed tonight, maybe I should just spend a minute introducing Michael Lynk for those who might not know him. I'm always a bit fussed by conversations that start off saying that so-and-so needs no introduction, because that seems a little bit crowdy. Like it's important to have people for whom an introduction is necessary. So Michael is a friend of mine of now 30 years and counting. Michael has a long history in the Middle East in particular. He's a professor of law at the University of Western Ontario. He was for 6 years the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, and wrote very important research-based reports. I think twice a year. I think you're writing research reports that were presented to the UN. So Michael is not only he's a lawyer, he's a Canadian, and he's an expert in the issues relating to Israel-Palestine. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
And Peter, thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to be speaking with you on this issue.
Well, I wish we had a happier issue to discuss, but it is a pleasure to talk to someone who can think about these issues seriously and thoughtfully. In the background, you don't see him, but in the background is my colleague, Grafton Ross, who will be monitoring the chat and the question and answers. So as we go through our discussion tonight, we're going to focus on what happened in 2025 and what might happen in 2026. You can alternately put issues in the chat, and I've set it up so that you can chat. Viewers can chat with each other. There's no problem there. You can carry on debates with each other if you want. Grafton will be monitoring the chat function, so if something comes up there, you may bring it in a conversation with us. You can raise your hand, and as possible, if you want to speak personally, you can do that within reason and with reasonable time limits, or you can write questions in your question and answer period. This is being recorded, and a recording of this whole session will be sent to everybody who attends tonight, as well as another 50 people who have registered but who are not able to be with us tonight. So, without more ado, I'll get right into it. And Michael, I think I want to start off with a broad question that's been bugging me for a while, and I'm interested in your thinking about it. Was the Hamas breakout on October 7th, now 2 years ago, was it a success or a failure? I'm going to phrase it with a sentence, and then I'll let you get into it. I
Sure.
mean, I think a lot of people. I've talked to many Palestinian human rights supporters who were very angry over it. Thought that Hamas had made this terrible mistake. Should have known that terrible pain was going to be inflicted on them by the Israelis, and that this was totally unreasonable by them to do it. But I think now there's some different people having different views. I'm interested in your take on this.
Sure. I'm going to offer you probably a gray answer with respect to this. I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways, but I think it's an important question to ask and to wind up debating. First of all, legally, obviously what happened on October 7th, 2023 by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups was a human rights atrocity. The killing and holding hostages of civilians, whoever they may be, is strictly forbidden by international law and can amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. Now, I understand that there's a question of whether or not these armed groups had initially intended to attack or capture civilians, or their primary purpose was to try to kidnap Israeli soldiers who were guarding the Gaza fence. There's also the question of how many of these civilians would have been killed by Israel in exercising what is known as the Hannibal Doctrine, in trying to limit the number of live civilians who were going to be taken into Gaza.
Right.
But having said that, the end result was that these Palestinian armed groups did kill civilians, both Israeli and foreign workers in Israel, and they also took others hostage, and that amounts to an international crime. And I'm not pretending at all, I don't think anybody here would be pretending that history began on October 7th. But the heart of your question really is more of a political question as to whether or not there was political success or failure on the part of Hamas and other armed groups as to what then wound up succeeding. I have a hard time saying this was a success. Given the catastrophic scale of the Israeli response, which would have come not as a surprise to virtually anybody, through the flattening of Gaza, the total destruction of Gaza, and the deaths of at least 70,000 Palestinians, and likely many more, the vast majority of whom are civilians. And in light of the strong backing given to Israel, politically, militarily, and economically by the United States, and to a lesser degree, the EU, this was an enormous price to pay for the Palestinians with respect to this. And I think it was a serious setback in the short run for the Palestinians. But I also have to say that a political explosion of this type was inevitable. You repress a people long enough with state-of-the-art weaponry and technology, and there is bound to be a decisive social response of some sort in reply. And I'm always reminded of what one of the preambles paragraphs of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948 wound up saying, where it said, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights have to be protected by the rule of law, and human rights for Palestinians and the sanctity of international law has not been protected by the United States or the global North with respect to Palestine over the last 80 years.
Let me put some ideas to you. I find it hard to believe that the Hamas leaders anticipated that what would result was the complete destruction of Gaza. But I think they knew from experience, they knew that Israel was going to respond very aggressively. They knew that for sure. They'd had enough experience of cast lead and all the other things. But I am guessing, and I haven't talked to anybody from Hamas, but I'm guessing that they believed too much our propaganda, that we wouldn't allow the wholesale destruction of a population. They probably anticipated a month or two of bombing, and that finally the world opinion would rise up and force Israel to back off. And they calculated that risk was worth it. So I feel that we lured them, we trapped them, we led them to believe that we really believed in human rights and international law, when in fact we don't.
I have a hard time accepting that, Peter, and I'll tell you why. We have passed over 30 binding resolutions at the Security Council, and hundreds of resolutions at the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council criticizing Israel with respect to the illegality of annexation, the illegality of the Israeli settlements, the necessity of Israel to abide by the Fourth Geneva Convention that this is occupied land. And then obviously with the important rulings that came down over the last year, particularly in July of 2024 from the International Court of Justice, that the occupation is illegal and it had to end as rapidly as possible. There's all kinds of evidence that while international law has spoken clearly and decisively with regards to the illegality of what Israel is doing, there's been no enforcement mechanism with respect to this.
But I think you're making my point rather than yours. We have passed all these laws, but we haven't done anything about it.
Precisely. So what?
We believe that the West would do something. They believe that the West would do something.
Right, but why would Hamas take in, who doesn't believe, by the way, in the structure of international law? Why would they have assumed that we would be moved by what Israel would decide to do in retaliation for what happened on October 7th?
Don't you think wasn't that? And I can't remember exactly how long Cass led, those various other, but Israel's calculation and all those things. They kept reading the New York Times and seeing when they had to finally stop. I think that Israel was paying very much attention to what the West was doing or not doing.
Well, I tend to disagree. I mean, the reaction that caused Cass led in 2014 or 2009, 809,
right?
And those are the two of the biggest episodes of Israeli assaults on Gaza prior to what began in October 2023, where there was much smaller, if you like, initiation by Hamas in terms of trying to change the status quo with respect to that. But as I said, part of it could have been a miscalculation or the fact that Hamas never calculated that so many Israeli civilians and foreign workers were going to be killed or kidnapped on October 7th, that they stumbled onto this rave party quite by accident and didn't even know it was there. All of these things are possible, but the end result was, the deaths of 1,100 Israeli civilians and foreign workers, the taking into Gaza of 250 hostages. Right. Israel, with the furthest, the most right-wing government has ever had, was going to respond decisively to whatever Hamas had done.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts there, Michael. I think we can both agree that I think you, in an earlier conversation, you referred to Joe and Lai was asked what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
And in fact, if 100 years from now the Palestinians have been wiped off the face of the earth, then we'll say this was a terrible event. But if, on the other hand, if Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, no longer exists, then this would have been like the Tet Offensive, or would have been like some precursor, which was a terrible disaster in the short run, but ended up being politically a very successful event. So we'll leave it at that for the. Unless I don't cut you off, but that's.
No, but let's also remember, I do want to point out, and maybe I'll take this opportunity very briefly to say, we have to also pay attention to what's happening on the West Bank. There's been the greatest number of housing unit approvals in 2025 in any of over the last 23 years where the UN has actually been taking account. We're now at somewhere around 760,000 Israeli settlers living illegally in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, with virtually no pushback coming from the global north. We've had Germany criticizing Israel, as a staunch ally of Israel, criticizing Israel for these new settlements, but not taking any decisive step. Israel really feels having to pay no cost at all for continuing to build the settlements, which are meant to plant an Israeli flag of sovereignty on the West Bank, and also to build up an enormous domestic political constituency that supports the settlements. So all of this means, this idea of what happened this summer at the United Nations of supporting a two-state solution is that the two-state solution is probably long gone, and we should be talking about its obituary rather than talking about its possibility.
Well, that leads to the second question I wanted to raise with you. In the summer, in September, Prime Minister Carney, after having considerable pressure from Palestinians in Canada and their supporters in Canada, and finally agreed that Canada would recognize the state of Palestine on certain conditions. It's still not quite clear what that means. We do recognize that if they do this, so I've talked to a number of people on the status, but anyway, we say we recognize the state of Palestine. Was that a good thing, or was that fig leaf? Was it just smoke and mirrors? What's your assessment of that?
Sure. I think it's a good thing, but I put a big asterisk beside it. Let's remember, ironically, that Canada was one of the very first countries in the world to recognize Israel in the late 1940s. And here it is, one of the very last countries to recognize Palestine in the 2020s with respect to this. And you're absolutely right. Its recognition of Palestine came with a number of qualifications, my asterisks, that are all on the where the finger is pointed at the Palestinians. There has to be political reform. There has to be administrative reform. There has to be elections, and so on. Israel, Canada put no conditions at all on Israel, which is illegally occupying the Palestinian territory, and which continues to defy more than 30 UN Security Council resolutions.
Michael, let me interrupt, because I think I know something that you know, but you didn't say it right. When Canada recognized, when the UN recognized Israel, there were some conditions. And Israel did not respect those, and never has respected those conditions. Yeah. Not when Canada, you're right. So Canada didn't apply any conditions, but the UN imposed certain conditions to respect previous resolutions of the United Nations.
Which included Resolution 194, which is in December 1948, which gave the right of Palestinians to be able to return to their homes and their homeland, where after 750,000 Palestinians had been forced out of Palestine during by the Israeli militias and army, and Israel had agreed as part of the conditions for joining the UN in 1949 to enforce all previous UN resolutions, including 194.
Including the borders.
Right. And I should point out that Resolution 194 is the most reaffirmed resolution in the history of the United Nations. It's been reaffirmed over 140 times since 1948.
That should do it.
Including, in 2024 and presumably now in 2025 as well.
Right. Excuse me. So then, given that, I'm sorry. Given that, Michael, is it useless for Canada to recognize? Why do you say you think it's a positive step, given the fact that, first of all, there are all these conditions, and second of all, we don't even seem to apply to do what we say we're going to do?
Sure. I think it's better that Canada has recognized the realization of Palestinian rights, because this raises, if you like, the obligations on Canada to recognize Palestinian sovereignty over what the International Court of Justice said is Palestinian territory, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And it would require Canada to wind up taking positive steps, positive political and diplomatic steps to protest the ongoing interference of Palestinian sovereignty by Israel, which we saw actually several days ago when Israeli border police refused to allow 30 Canadians, including 6 parliamentary MPs, to enter into Palestinian West Bank, alleging that the money that's been funding their trip comes from terrorist organizations. That Israel has no right to be ruling the West Bank. It has no right to be deciding who comes and goes with respect to the West Bank. That ought to be the thrust of what Canada should be saying and protesting what Israel did in refusing to allow these Canadians into the West Bank.
I noticed that Minister Anand made a tweet complaining to the Israelis, but she complained about the fact that MP Iqud Khalid was apparently manhandled at the border, which of course she should complain about, but didn't mention anything about the fact that by Canadian law now, those Israeli military folks have no right to be interfering in the movement from Canadians from Jordan to the state of Palestine.
Right. And I've not heard Canada say anything with respect to the decision or the advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice in July of 2024, saying that the occupation is illegal and has to be ended as rapidly as possible. That you would have thought would be part of all talking points that Canada would be saying with respect to Israel and Palestine. I didn't see that at all mentioned with respect to the recognition when Canada gave that this summer.
Well, it would seem to me that it's now that Canada has said this, it's up to us and civil society to be saying, okay, you said that. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to put it in application? We can't allow them to be ignoring the fact that our law has just been transgressed by, in this case, by Israeli forces.
Precisely, and that's what I think should be part of the talking points with respect to civil society in Canada that advocates on Palestine and Palestinian rights. Is our approaches to the government should also include the issue of Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, that Israel is now illegally interfering with that. We remember that the UN General Assembly passed a resolution in September 2024 welcoming the advisory opinion coming from the International Court of Justice and gave Israel a strict timeline, 12 months, i.e. September 2025, to totally end its occupation, to remove all of its settlements and all of its settlers. That hasn't happened. And that it should be part of the talking points we in civil society say to the government. And in turn, the government should be saying with respect to its relations with Israel.
Michael, let's turn. First of all, I remind people if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Grafton Ross is in the background, and he will be monitoring the questions. Also, or if you want to raise your hand, flag the raise hand. In about another, Michael and I will talk for another 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for those of you who want to raise questions or make points. It doesn't have to be a question. Michael, a month or so ago now, the UN Security Council voted a unanimous, apart from that there were 2 abstentions, but otherwise it was a unanimous vote, that basically put Donald Trump in charge of Gaza. I mean, it was an amazing resolution, and Muslim countries voted in favor. Somalia voted in favor of it. Argentina, Algeria voted in favor. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, was in favor of it. And yet, to most observers, I'm sure I didn't see you write on this specifically, but Craig McIver or other people who are very well known UN experts said this resolution basically wiped out all that body of law that you're just referring to, the ICJ and decisions of the General Assembly, and basically went back to say Palestinians don't have the right to self-determination. Donald Trump has the right to it. So let's go through it. First of all, tell us, first of all, what was in the resolution so we're all on the same page.
Sure. So this is Resolution 2803, adopted, as you said, 13 votes in favor at the UN Security Council and 2 abstentions coming from 2 permanent members, Russia and China. This had been the result of extensive negotiations with the United States and Israel, and then with the United States and a number of Arab countries that he's grown close to, including the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and in the end, it was adopted. You know, whenever I think of the United Nations and Palestine, I think of 2 paradoxes in the relationship. One is that the United Nations is indispensable to the articulation and fulfillment of Palestinian rights. But on the other hand, the other part of the paradox is it's entirely ineffectual when it comes to trying to realize Palestinian rights according to international law and UN resolutions. And 2803, this resolution that was adopted 5 weeks ago on the 17th of November, is a prime example of this. This is probably one of the very worst resolutions ever adopted by the UN Security Council. And I think in historians' views, it will be deemed to be a part of their shame that it wind up occurring. Part of the reason why 2803 came about, I think, has to do with how political irrelevant the Arab political leadership is in the modern world. I'm old enough to know that in 1973, in the immediate aftermath of the October 1973 war between Israel and Egypt and Syria, that there was a decisive oil embargo brought on by the oil-producing Arab states which rocked the world economy and finally put the issue of Palestine and peace in the Middle East on the international agenda, put it right to the very top. And what happens this time, after 2 years of a genocide, we don't see any of the Arab countries who had created diplomatic relationships with Israel over the last 5 to 10 years, or who had joined the Abraham Accords with respect to that, breaking relationships with Israel. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, Egypt signed a $35 billion gas deal with Israel, almost as a reward to Israel in the aftermath of the Gaza genocide. So what does 2803 do? It winds up creating, as you said, this board of peace, which Donald Trump winds up chairing. It puts the United States, if you like, in charge with very loose language on the future of Gaza. The Palestinians have very much a tertiary role in deciding their own future with respect to this. In terms of the $70 billion that the World Bank is estimating will be needed to begin the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Gaza, that's expected to come from an international fund, probably primarily funded by many of these Arab states. There's no requirement at all for Israel, which committed this genocide in violation of international law, to pay any kind of reparations or money towards rebuilding what they themselves had wind up destroying in violation of international law. So it does mention, at the insistence of the Arab states, that there would be the possibility of a future Palestinian state and the realization of Palestinian self-determination, but it sets no timeline whatsoever. And when we think of all the past failed peace agreements, from the Oslo Agreement in the 1993 to the Camp David II negotiations in 2000, to the Annapolis Agreement in the early 2000s, they all had time limits and timelines to meet, and yet they failed. This one has no timelines whatsoever, probably at the assistance of Israel. So there's no guaranteed timeline for the Palestinians to ever realize what had been promised to them by international law and by this advisory opinion 18 months ago coming from the International Court of Justice.
Michael, I see often sort of complaints aimed at the UN, how useless it is. How could the UN Security Council make such a terrible decision? But in fact, it was all of the countries that were there that voted in favor of it. Algeria and Somalia and Indonesia. I can't remember the names of the countries. So whether they were on or not on the Security Council doesn't really. So why did so many Arab or Muslim countries vote in favor of this? I'll come back to a second question, which I have some ideas on, but why the Chinese and the Russians abstained. But first of all, do you have any insight on why those Arab countries voted?
I think it has to do with the relationship that some of these Arab countries, in particular Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, are hoping to establish with Donald Trump. I think the relationships they're hoping to have with the United States administration is purely transactional. And for that, they were allowed, if you like, inside the tent to negotiate some of the language for what became Resolution 2803. And once they were in the tent and they agreed to this language and realized that Donald Trump was going to put his backing to it, they then went out and told the rest of the Security Council that they were in favor of it. The Palestinians, who have very little weight, unfortunately, when it comes to this resolution, realized they had no choice but to appear to be on board with respect to this, and hoping to maintain some relationships with these Arab countries.
I was told that the PA was actually lobbying countries to vote in favor of it. It wasn't just that they were going along with it. They were actively.
I think they realized they had no choice with respect to that. I've had honest conversations with some senior Palestinians in the last few weeks, and they didn't like the language. They realized the trap, they said, that they were entering into. But the senior leadership, they said, realized they really had no choice to be able to go against what Saudi Arabia or Egypt or the UAE or Qatar were now pushing for because of their transactional relationship with with the United States. So I think from that, I think either China or Russia, and certainly Russia, I think, was prepared to issue a veto with respect to this until they were told, both these veto-wielding countries were told that the Arabs were inside of it, the Palestinians were inside of it, and therefore there was really nothing to gain for China or for Russia to want to veto that if or they had realized in trying to make their own proposal a week or two before in early November that they had their own language, which was a much better language, and it was referring to the whole body of UN Security Council resolutions and the whole body of principles about self-determination and the end of occupation. They were prepared to put that kind of resolution forward, but then they were told the United States was going to veto it. So I think in the end, China and Russia determined that there was nothing to gain by vetoing this, and that they couldn't be more Palestinian than the Palestinian Authority.
I think the Russians said something like, can't be more Catholic than the Pope or something like that. It was, and I think also Ambassador Friedman, Charles Friedman, estimates that probably they figured it's not going to work anyway. Like right now, the Trump's having a lot of trouble recruiting the stabilization force, and so it's better not to be the bad guys for having prevented this thing, because Trump had said, if you don't do this, we're going to allow the Israelis to bomb the hell out of the Israelis. So they didn't want to be caught with being responsible for that when it was likely going to fail in any event.
And I think that's a good point to make, Peter, is that there's an anticipation this is not going to go far. And you're absolutely right with respect to the recruitment efforts by the United States to get countries, particularly in Arab and Muslim countries, to agree to join this international stabilization force. We've got cold feet being expressed by Pakistan, by Indonesia, by Azerbaijan, and it sounds like Israel is vetoing the possibility of Turkey wind up joining. But all of these countries, I think, have cold feet because they don't want to be seen as being the new occupiers and doing Israel's bidding in trying to disarm Hamas. Hamas has said, we're willing to disarm, but only when Israel winds up leaving and ends the occupation, and there is a clear path to Palestinian statehood and self-determination. And that's not, I mean, that's consistent with international law and UN resolutions with regards to this. So I suspect that the U.S. it may want to put up more pressure, or it finally just may throw up its hands and said, we can't, this is mission impossible. And then we go back to possibly the reopening of this assault, which I should say there never really has been a ceasefire since the 10th of October. We have over almost 400 Palestinians who've been killed in the last 2 months. We have Israel now occupying 58% of the Gaza Strip, and it's the senior IDF commander is saying this is our new sovereignty line.
Finkelstein argues, Norman Finkelstein argues that the real purpose of this was to take this issue, by calling it a ceasefire, to take this issue off the front page of the newspaper. And in fact, that's been quite successful, because today we're hearing about the terrible events in Australia, or about this American actor who was shot by his son, or whatever. That Gaza doesn't even really hardly appear. So, and fortunately, the MPs going in there raised the issue a little bit in Canada. So, listen, somebody had their hand up to ask a question, and now they don't anymore. I don't know if they got frustrated having to wait, but I'm now encourage people to raise their hands. Click on the raise hand if you want to raise a question directly. Or Grafton, if you got some. Oh, well, okay, David Kattenberg. I see David. Well, allow you to talk. There you go. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hey all, and hello, Michael. My question is, is the International Criminal Court going to be crushed by the Trump-Rubio regime? It seems like it's on the, poised to be, like, I think that the International Criminal Court is the last vestige of the international legal system that actually has the capacity to hold Israeli war criminals to account. The International Court of Justice it's toothless, but the International Criminal Court has the ability to hold Netanyahu and other Israelis accountable. But the United States Trump and Rubio are dead set on crushing it. What do you think?
Michael, what do you think? What's the future of the ICC?
I think the ICC will be here for some time, and I think it's an excellent question that David has posed. Let's review what's actually happened. The International Criminal Court, which was set up by the Rome Statute of 1998, has authority over individuals who may be committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide in the international community. The International Criminal Court, based in The Hague, said it had jurisdiction in 2021 over any international crimes that may be taking place on the soil of Palestine, i.e. Gaza, the West Bank, or East Jerusalem, because the state of Palestine had been admitted as a member state to the Rome Statute. So there's been a number of applications being filed primarily by Palestinian civil society, putting forth allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide to the investigators at the International Criminal Court and to the prosecutor's office. So the prosecutor's office asked for, in May of 2024, for arrest warrants to be issued against 3 Hamas leaders and against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and against his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And finally, a decision was made in November 2024 by the International Criminal Court, issuing arrest warrants against those 2 Israeli officials, plus, I think, against a Hamas leader who was later determined to have been killed during the course of what happened in Gaza. The reaction of both Israel and the United States was disbelief and great anger. At that time, when the arrest warrants were issued in November 2024, the Biden administration was still in power. So in February of 2025, as part of one of the early sets of executive orders being issued by the Trump administration, they put diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, on the prosecutor and several of the judges. That was expanded in June or July of this year. And I understand that another ICC judge yesterday or today has now been sanctioned as well. And when you have American sanctions put on you, as has also been done by onto my successor as UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, it creates an enormous economic havoc in your personal life. It means it's almost impossible to do any banking. If you have any property in the United States, that property winds up being frozen with respect to this. Your ability to be able to be paid for activities that you're doing, your ability to be able to go to the United Nations in New York has been stopped, as what's happened to Francesca Albanese. So American sanctions on somebody through these executive orders has devastating impact. But the ICC, at least the 18 of the judges, have said recently that they believe in the mission of the International Criminal Court. They won't be thwarted by what the United States has done with respect to this, and the investigations with respect to the possibility of further charges being laid regarding war crimes or crimes against humanity, or indeed genocide against Israeli political and military leaders, continues.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to see there's a number of people who've raised questions in the Q&A. Grafton, can you, some of them are longish, can you summarize one there for the pitch to Michael?
Well, maybe if I could start by just following up on David Kattenberg's question. You've said, Michael, that all of these things that the International Criminal Court is doing, but I mean, what is the likelihood that Benjamin Netanyahu will wind up in The Hague?
You mean that fugitive from justice?
Yes.
Look, this means that Europe, for the rest of his life, is going to be off limits for most countries. Now, there are several supporters of Israel, and I think Italy and Germany and Hungary have said that they would not arrest him. This will probably, if that was the case, and he actually took them up on their offer to visit Rome or Berlin or Budapest again, that would probably start to create a crisis within the Assembly of Member States of the Rome Statute. But for the most part, I mean, when asked a month or two ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney said, would he arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he came to Canada? And he said in one word, yes. It wasn't something he probably wanted to elaborate on, but he was clear that he takes the obligations that Canada has as a founding member of the Assembly of member states of the Rome Statute very seriously. And I do point out that one of the 11 or 12 judges on the ICC who has been sanctioned is a Canadian judge, Kimberly Prost, a very well-respected lawyer working in the federal public service for a long period of time before she was voted to become a judge. I've not heard Canada raise issues, publicly at least, with the United States over the sanctions imposed on the Canadian judge and the ICC, the way in which France did when the French judge was sanctioned by the United States. It may be that Canada wants to keep this relatively low, and they may, but may not have issued private reservations to the United States or private protests with respect to the sanctions. But I would have wished that Canada would have been more forthright in trying to defend the international rule of law.
What's her name again?
Kimberly Prost, P-R-O-O-S-T.
Okay, check that one out. Grafton, have you got another one in the Q&A file?
Yes, we've spoken about the shortcomings of the Security Council resolution. One of our participants is wondering whether the General Assembly could invoke the Uniting for Peace resolution and establish a regime that would get humanitarian aid and medicine and so on into Gaza.
Yeah.
Can I just review what that resolution is? Michael?
Uniting for Peace is a resolution that was first used, actually, I think, by the United States, but used in the very beginning of the 1950s when there was a deadlock at the Security Council that the General Assembly could actually take matters on that particular issue, in this case, Korea and the Korean War, into its own hands, and in that case, vote for a United Nations force being sent to Korea with respect to the war and the I think the alleged invasion of South Korea by North Korean forces. So that's been used several times. What it would take, quite frankly, is the Palestinian Authority, the state of Palestine, using its political capital to say, we want to create a different sort of regime coming out of the General Assembly that would wind up binding Israel to obey the advisory opinion that was adopted by the International Court of Justice in October 2025, saying that Israel was failing to meet its obligations as a member state to allow aid to go into Gaza at scale to be able to feed the Palestinians and house the Palestinians. And that still is continuing to be breached even today. We're having less than half the number of trucks a day entering into Gaza because of Israeli restrictions. There was a statement made by a number of UN special rapporteurs and a number of civil society organizations who are active in Gaza, critical of Israel and critical of the small amount of aid getting into Gaza each day at a time of extraordinary need, given the atmospheric rivers pouring rain on Gaza and young children dying of hypothermia because of the incessant cold that's there.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Paul Tetreault, who's got his hand raised, but Grafton, I want to flag for you. Rick McElroy has asked, what do polls say about the position of Canadian Jews regarding the actions of Israel in Gaza and the West Bank? You're our key statistician. If you have an answer or a reference for him, that would be useful. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn to Paul Tetreault and allow you to talk. Paul, are you there? Paul Tetreault? Going one more time. Paul Tetreault, are you there?
Paul is a fellow labor lawyer.
Right, from BC as well.
That's correct.
Well, maybe he'll have to raise his hand again, then I guess he lost his place here. So Grafton, I got you doing double duty here. I thought you'd look up that other thing while Paul was with me.
I will get those references either before the end of this, or we'll send it out in the
okay. All right.
in an email following up.
Okay.
There's a similar question in the chat
Okay.
asking what do polls say regarding Canadian Jews' position on recognizing Palestine on the two-state solution. And I will dig up that information.
Okay.
So another question is, can Michael offer his perspective about the two-state versus the one-state solution?
Good.
Very good question. I'm actually writing a piece right now with respect to two states, and I'm entitling it "The Broken Clock," because for the last 40 plus years, the global North has been using the term 5 minutes to midnight to describe how close we are to ending the window of a possibility of a two-state solution because of the changing demography in East Jerusalem and the West Bank by the rapid growth of Israeli settlements and the number of Israeli settlers in occupied Palestinian territory. I can say, that in 1982, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Mervyn Ben-Venisti, had used the term 5 minutes to midnight in 1984 to say we've passed 5 minutes to midnight. There's now 39,000 settlers in with the West Bank and another 60 or 70,000 settlers in East Jerusalem. The idea of being able to move those settlers and allowing a Palestinian state to emerge on occupied Palestinian territory has passed. And the West has continually used the term 5 minutes to midnight through the last 20 to 25 years, saying, trying to develop a sense of urgency that we need to move because the window is closing, but never saying that the window has possibly closed when now in 2025, we're at 760,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and over 360 settlements on Palestinian territory with respect to that. My sense is that and I'm going to echo what Peter Beinart has said in the sense of saying it's a much better argument to be able to make calling for unity and justice than it is calling for partition. And that on the one hand, the ability to be able to move settlers out of the occupied territory, even though they're there illegally, and even though the Israeli settlements are a war crime under both Canadian and international law, it's probably too big a burden to try to expect that we're ever going to be able to move the settlers with respect to this. But on the other hand, the idea of creating some kind of single state, democratic binational state of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, one person, one vote, and if you like, some rift off what happened in South Africa would be, I think, probably a much better solution for both Israeli Jews and Palestinians in the long run. I no longer see the chances of a two-state solution ever emerging with respect to this. And if it did, I'd have my doubts as to whether or not a Palestinian state would be able to have the kind of state sovereignty and a military to defend itself adequately against Israeli incursions. But let's remember that there's virtually nobody in Israeli political circles today, either on the right and not even on the center, and there's virtually no left who calls for a two-state solution. Even so-called Israeli liberals, such as Yair Lapid, are against the Palestinian state. So the consensus of the possibility of trying to build or rebuild a constituency that would support a Palestinian state, I think, is done. And I don't see the possibility of what a Palestinian state would look like. It would look very much what Donald Trump had come up with 5 years ago during his Peace to Prosperity plan, which was a series of little isolated, separated Bantustans. So my sense is that I think the one-state solution of some variety is the only way forward.
Michael, with respect, I think you are underestimating the power of Zionism. I think even if a border were to be drawn at some point, the Israelis would never be satisfied with it. And because they're much more powerful, they would be looking for an opportunity to break that. There's just no way, like they didn't agree with the 67 borders in the first place. it's an impossible situation unless you had international troops there all the time. As long as the Israelis are armed to the hilt and they believe that God gave them the land, even if they don't believe in God, that God gave them the land, they're just going to keep on pushing and pushing, and there's no such thing as a solution in that way.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with any of that, Peter. I accept it. I figured you wanted a 3-minute answer rather than a 15-minute answer with respect to this. But just remember what I'd said before, that the whole purpose of creating civilian settlements on occupied land, that's been illegal under international law since 1949 under the four Geneva Conventions. But the whole purpose of doing that is twofold. One is to put a flag of sovereignty onto the land. Why else would you put civilians onto occupied territory? But the second is to begin to create and nurture and develop a domestic political constituency. And now you have around 13 to 14% of Israeli Jews living in occupied Palestinian territory. You now have that constituency that is firmly in favor of continuation of the settlements and the expansion of Israel's borders to annex all of the West Bank, as they've already done with respect to East Jerusalem.
Well, I'd love to have some more conversation with you on this, Mike. I'll let some other people get in here. Jess Carr, you've raised your hand. Do you want to say something? Jess?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much for this discussion. Michael, I have a question, and I saw someone else in the chat had something similar, so I'm going to put our questions together. How do you feel is, number one, sort of the path forward for true justice for the Palestinians? Over the last few years, we've all witnessed this destruction of international law and humanity. So what levers does civil society have, especially with respect to the Canadian sort of civil society? Is there any way, sort of what else could we be doing to push the government, enact those levers to make sure that, Canada demands a date by which the state of Palestine is recognized, and a way to actually make that happen?
Sure. Great question, Jess. The things that I would say have to be on, the top of the list for what civil society and for people who advocate for justice and advocate for justice in the Middle East would want to say is, yes, support the right of the Palestinians to a state, and a state immediately with respect to this. Demand that the government follow through with respect to supporting the work of the International Court of Justice, saying that the occupation is illegal. I don't hear them saying that. And that Israel must leave the occupied territories immediately. That deadline ended 3 months ago in the middle of September. In terms of practical things, keep in mind that the government has always been allergic to the BDS movement, but boycott, sanctions, and are all actually consistent with international law. The three demands of the BDS movement internationally is the right of equality, a full democratic equality to Palestinians living in 1948 Israel. That's consistent with international law. The right of Palestinian refugees to return. As I said before, that's been Resolution 194, been reaffirmed over 140 times by the United Nations General Assembly. And the right to end the occupation and have a Palestinian state emerge. And that also is a bedrock of international law. So what the BDS movement is calling for in terms of boycotting and sanctioning and divesting are all issues, all have at the heart of what they say issues that are close to international law. I don't expect as a lawyer to come and make you all lawyers with respect to this. I think law is a tool with respect to this, but it's a useful tool. And if you're able to say that the occupation is illegal, the settlements are illegal, annexation is illegal, the application of the Fourth Geneva Convention is primary with respect to this, and be able to use these UN resolutions, you've got a powerful argument that really nobody can wind up disagreeing with. And I remember when I first started advocating for a new advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice when I was special rapporteur, and I said, it's a powerful argument to be able to say something is illegal, and to say that the occupation is illegal and has to end immediately, that it's well past its shelf date. is something we should be using with our elected representatives and our federal government with respect to this. And I think you're going to find, I mean, 5 of the 6 Canadian MPs who were turned back trying to enter into the West Bank the other day are liberal backbenchers. I think you're beginning to find that not only the NDP, not only the Green Party, but there's a significant number and growing number of liberal MPs, particularly those who come from diaspora communities or represent large diaspora communities in Canada, who are on side with respect to this as well. So now is the moment to be able to go ahead and start making these kinds of arguments to comply with international law. Canada's always said we're a country of international law. Come on and prove it now.
If I could just follow up on the one state, two state discussion. You've indicated that one state is really the only possible outcome. Why then does Canada, the United Nations, indeed the entire international community, cling to the two-state solution?
Well, it's interesting because probably the Palestinian leadership hasn't yet had its South Africa moment with regards to this. Certainly virtually anybody I talk to in Palestinian civil society, and this is one of the most assertive, knowledgeable civil societies I've ever come across anywhere. They all support a one-state solution. What it looks like exactly, either some have very definitive ideas, others have a more general approach to this. But the Palestinian Authority leadership hasn't come to the conclusion that a two-state solution is dead. They're still trying to get more countries to come on board with a two-state solution. So until you have the Palestinian Authority begin to say, look, a two-state solution that window is closed, we're in favor of a one-state solution, you won't have that rippling across the international diplomatic community.
I think it's also a very safe position for a Canadian politician. It's to most Canadians who don't look very deeply into the issue, two states for two people sounds on the face of it like fair, right? It sounds good.
Yeah. If I can just say one more thing, there was a great article a couple of weeks ago in, of all places, the New York Times. It was written by Ben Rhodes, who was the speechwriter and national security advisor to Barack Obama, and who himself is Jewish. And he said, with respect, Ben Rhodes, yes, and he said, look, the simplest thing would be to do the right thing. And this is what he was calling for, which if he's calling for this and can get it published in the New York Times, this ought to be on our agenda as well. He said, refuse to provide military assistance to a government that has committed war crimes. Support the International Criminal Court. Oppose any efforts by Israel to annex any part of the West Bank or ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, and stand up for democracy, he said, true democracy in Israel. All of these things, I think, should be near or the top of our kind of agenda, both when we speak publicly, but also when we speak to our government leaders as well.
Once again, anybody who wants to raise their hand and speak, do so. Grafton, if you got some questions there in the bag.
Yes. Can you comment on the proposed federal bill C9 and what impact that might have on pro-Palestinian activities in Canada?
You're going to remind me what C9 is. There are several bills that are being debated right now in the House of Commons, and I can't say that I've stayed on top of them.
It's the anti-hate bill, right?
It's the anti-hate bill, yes, and it will include a number of provisions which will limit protest and so on.
Yeah, I guess I'm a big supporter of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it's occurred to me that as long as there's been discussions over the last 15 to 20 years with respect to the last 10 to 15 years over the adoption in Canada of the definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that the reason why it may have been adopted informally as policy, but never brought into legislation in Canada, is that I think the federal government and many provincial governments have realized that it would unlikely stand a charter challenge with respect to freedom of expression under Section 2B of the Charter of Rights. I know that's that's a legal answer to this sort of question. But that's why I think the governments have been tiptoeing around this, and I think they're also beginning to realize.
And my internet's breaking up.
Okay.
I also realized that. I'm sorry. Now I've lost my my train of thought with respect to this. But they realize, I think, that anti-Semitism is very real in Canada and in the world, but also that it has a tendency to be used by some groups that fervently support Israel as a cudgel by which to attack those who are advocating for Palestinian rights. Of the 11 examples that are used with respect to anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, 7 of them have to do with Israel. And as we've seen, a number of Jewish groups that oppose the occupation and support Palestinian rights say that it's a false choice between supporting a far-right government in Israel and supporting the rights of Jews everywhere to safety and sanctuary.
We have time for a couple more questions. Grafton, if you got some more there.
Yes, Michael, can you comment further on the role that China might play in this? You mentioned that China abstained on the Security Council vote because of concerns over the tariff and relations with the United States, but they've also hosted meetings of Palestinian political factions. Where do you see their role?
Sure. I think of this as 2 Chinas. One China is the diplomatic China, which will support Palestinians. That's for a long time voting in favor of the resolutions that come to the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council, when it's on the Human Rights Council, regarding Palestinian rights. China has been a significant backer of this, and you're absolutely right as well that it's hosted meetings by different factions of Palestinian groups and trying to build some kind of unity to strengthen Palestinian political influence. On the other hand, I must say that China does, its arms industry does wind up trading and selling arms to Israel, which is something that disappoints me with respect to this, and it's something that I would have wished China would be more consistent with in supporting Palestinian rights, not only in terms of UN voting, but in other ways as well.
Anybody else? Any other questions there in the bag?
Yes. What do you think? One of our participants is wondering, what do you think about the changing tone in the U.S. media about Israel and its role in the U.S. foreign policy? For example, cracks in the MAGA movement.
There are cracks in the MAGA movement, yes, and there's also cracks in the Democratic Party as well. I mean, how else do we see a young, charismatic Muslim in his mid-30s with not a huge amount of political experience come up and take a very principled stand with respect to Palestinian rights in a very Jewish city, which is New York City, and wind up getting elected overwhelmingly? Yes, it has a lot to do with his charisma and with his platform of affordability in New York. And yes, he's a different sort of Democratic Party politician, but he obviously opens the door to others to be able to say much more openly that we're going to refuse money coming from the Israel lobby in the United States, to refuse money coming from AIPAC or from other like-minded organizations, and to be able to take a much more critical stance. The big issue now is what happens in the Democratic Party. I'm not so sure there's going to be legs within the MAGA movement with respect to Israel and the Republican Party. I think there's too large an influence, both with respect to Israel lobby money going to the Republican Party and with respect to the strength of the Christian Zionist movement in the Republican Party. I'm much more hopeful that we'll see the kinds of changes we've longed to see in the Democratic Party, and it begins to reform itself. And that indeed was the whole point of the article by Ben Rhodes in the New York Times several weeks ago, which I see Grafton has just circulated among you, is that he was looking for the Democratic Party to stand up for principles and realize that one of the contributing reasons for the Democratic Party's loss in November 2024 in the presidential election was the Democratic Party's very strong support of Israel under Joe Biden.
Desmond Sekera, I see that you've raised your hand. Would you like to say something? Can you hear us?
Muted.
Thank you very much, Michael. You appear to be most skeptical about the two-state solution. What is it that makes you feel that a supposed one-state solution is going to be more viable?
Sure. Very good question, Desmond. If I had given the 15-minute answer, I would have made sure that I talked about the challenges to trying to create a one-state solution. As Peter Larson has mentioned, we still have an extraordinary imbalance of power, diplomatic power, military power, economic power between Israel and the Palestinians. And it's unlikely that you're going to, and certainly in the short run, be able to address the questions of the deep-seated nature of Zionism within Israel that the Palestinians or the world community can wind up addressing, because that's going to be a key issue for the ability for a one-state solution, first of all, to be founded and then to wind up succeeding with respect to this. It was obviously an issue of power, but a much different balance of power between whites in South Africa who were defending apartheid and those who opposed apartheid, including obviously the African, the Asian, and small segments of the white community that brought apartheid to an end. We don't have anywhere near that balance of power in Israel and Palestine to see that in the future. But I think, I believe in the power of positive persuasion on these issues. Putting aside the issue of power, if we make the case that it's impossible to have, the kind of democratic values which at least the global North claims it prefers and supports, it's impossible to wind up having that with a truncated Palestinian Bantustan and an over-dominant Israel with respect to that. That the only way to do that is the path to a one-state binational community. And I recommend a new book that's come out by the leaders of the organization Democracy for the Arab World Now, based in Washington, who've just published a book on the pathway to a one-state solution.
That's Dawn, D-A-W-N.
Yes.
Maybe before we go, Grafton might be able to find the link to that. Thank you very much, Grafton, and to Marlene for finding links to respond to some of the questions that people raised. Michael, I'm going to put the last question to you before I'm just going to do a wind-up here. Jess asks, given your experience, is there anything that makes you hopeful, or do things look dark?
Sure. It's interesting that you asked that, because I think the kinds of things that, and there's been, certainly in my experience in reading about human rights movements over the last 200 years, no human rights movement ever succeeded over the last 200 years. And certainly the ones, say, within the lifetime of some of us, like the civil rights movement or the disability rights movement or the gay rights movement or the feminist movement, without leaders who were imbued with optimism, because the odds against them, certainly as they began their movements and their struggles for equal rights, were so daunting with respect to this. And it does appear that Palestinian rights, the achievement of Palestinian rights, is so daunting now. But if you're fearless with respect to this, if you're responsible with respect to the evidence you rely upon and the way in which you articulate your advocacy for Palestinian rights, and you're optimistic, then my sense is you're going to walk down a very long path, and you're going to have a lot of people wind up following you with respect to this. My optimism, in some small part, comes from the fact that I dealt a lot, not only with Palestinian civil society organizations, but also with Israeli anti-occupation and civil society organizations as well. And I saw those two organizations as speaking the same human rights language, having the same view of the world, having the same, I guess, respect for one another, and for the most part, having the same long-term vision of where Palestinians and Israelis would wind up living together in prosperity and in peace together. So it was their willingness, if you like, to walk the walk, to oppose in a very difficult society, to be on the side of human rights, of international law, and Palestinian rights that I saw with respect to both the Israeli civil society organizations and the Palestinian organizations. That's what gives me, if you like, part of my optimism that this will finally wind up succeeding in realizing that kind of dream.
Thank you, Michael. I see that Grafton has put up our normal little pitch for donations in the webinar chat. I'd like to do a codicil on that for this special event. All the money that we received, we're going to give to WAN, the We Are Not Numbers, which is an organization of young Palestinian writers talking the theme of optimism. We Are Not Numbers was created by a man named Rifat Al-Arir, a well-known Palestinian poet who I had the opportunity to meet in Gaza in 2018, and he was assassinated by Israelis in the month or so after October 7th. So if you send any money in, we will be glad to collect it and pass it on to We Are Not Numbers. Grafton is absolutely right. We are a hand-to-mouth voluntary organization. We normally do a little begging at the end and ask for people to give us support, but this time we will be glad to pass it on to an organization that gives me and should give all of us optimism. Our next event will not be until January. On January the 12th, we're going to be interviewing a man named Jonathan Cook. Jonathan is a British and actually a British Israeli journalist who lived several years in Israel, and he's a journalist, and he's going to talk to us about the ways that Israel, the mechanisms by which Israel controls or shapes the narrative coming out of Israel for its journalists. He's had a lot of experience trying to get stories published and trying to work around Israeli control, and I think we'll find it all quite educational. And I'm going to be helped in that by a young woman named Pascal. A young Canadian, this is my age showing, a young Canadian journalist who worked for CBC for 10 years and finally got kind of forced out because of her pro-Palestinian views. And so she's going to talk a bit about some of the difficulties that she faced working as an insider at CBC. Pascal Matar. Oh dear, someone's going to send me a nasty letter, but it's close to that. But I apologize, Pascal, already. So there we go. Thank you very much. Thank you to Michael for sharing your insights, your knowledge, your experience, and your general good looks with us. Grafton, thank you very much. We didn't get to see your good looks, but you were able to provide information from the back, and thanks for doing the follow-up. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. And as Grafton says, a recording of this webinar will be posted in a few days. I'll send you all a link to it, and you can share it with your friends. And so good night to all, and we'll talk to you all next year. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.